Hello once again, everyone. So last week we talked about the offensive guards with the backsword, and today we're going to be talking about the defensive guards. Now, what is a defensive guard slash parry, really? So, of our three guards that we had offensively, not counting the medium guard, two of them are already going to become defensive guards. But mostly what this means, especially when it comes to Angelo, is the idea that they are positions you move to with the slip or shift. So the slip or the shift is in Angelo's system what you're going to do every time you parry. If someone cuts for me, I'm going to shift back as I defend myself. Now this does a couple things. Number one, it ensures that I am moving out of presence. So that way, if they are attacking at me, I will end up more toward my end of distance. I'm farther away from them. This is also making my lead leg very light, which is good because a common trick that you will see, both from newer fighters, continental style fighters, and just fighters in general, is they're going to feint high or up or whatever and then quickly cut that lead leg. So if every time someone cuts at me I bring myself back, I'm never really in danger initially. Later down the line it can become more dangerous, as I have briefly talked about before, but for the most part it keeps you pretty safe and has certainly saved my leg more than a few times. So the defensive guards are going to be ones that are done with the slip. So for pretty much all of them, my feet will be together. Now, there are various versions of the slip. You will see sometimes just that. You will see a straightening. You will see the foot brought back so the heels are touching. You will see fully passing backwards. All of these roughly fall into the same category. I, however, am most familiar with using this one. So now we come to the discussion of whether or not these are guards or if they're more of parries, because as terminology changes, you will have, parrying into whatever, etc. It's kind of a mixed bag depending upon who you're learning from at the time, so I'm going to refer to them as guards, but you may also see them referred to as parries. So, without further ado, let's go over some familiar ones, shall we? So our first is going to be our outside guard, which, when we shift back, remains the outside guard. Nothing really changes here. The important thing to remember is if someone cuts kind of high on this line, remember they are still coming for you. You can just slightly raise the tip. Don't raise your guard up. If you raise your basket up, you're leaving yourself very vulnerable to being cut from below. You don't want to end up here, you want to remain here. My sword tip will protect me, it will catch and glide down. If they try to really overpower me, then I can protect myself by moving into a hanging guard as they go through. I do not want to try and punch that basket up. So, you form an outside guard, same as you normally do. You shift, you're there. Inside guard, exact same idea. Once again, I don't want to try and raise my basket out to try and catch it. That's just going to lead to me getting cut low, though on some disarms, you do put the basket up intentionally. The Turkish disarm, for example, from Page, does specifically have you raising up in that way. So that is a tool to be used, not in this case though. So if I need to, I just use my tip. And this one in particular is very strong because it's lined up with my core. So that's the inside. Now the hanging. That one does change. So I've got my hanging guard of various different kinds, right? But now when I shift, I'm going to move into St. George, right? Everybody's favorite parry. So what does St. George actually do for you, and how does it differ from the hanging guard? Because can't I just parry like this? You can, strictly speaking, you can. But the downside of it is that it's not terribly hard to blow through someone's wrist in this way. If you move yourself now horizontal, you are much stronger, not to mention, if someone is really looking like they're going to blow through, I can move my guard over to protect me. Like I talked about before when we were holding the hanging guard, I can shift my St. George over a little bit more to put the strong of my weapon slash my actual basket above where that cut is going to land. But for the most part, you're going to see it pretty much like this. Now, it can be held flat horizontal, or it can be held at a slight angle. I'll usually hold it at a slight angle because I like it to then slide off as opposed to flat catch. You will not see it up like this. That turns into a very different kind of parry. But an important thing to know about forming your St. George is make sure that it is held diagonally away from your head, not right over your head. This will just lead to your face getting cut. This is out in front and keeping you safe. So, that's pretty much St. George. What are the vulnerabilities of St. George? Because real quick, let's go over that. Like the outside parry, obviously you're vulnerable here. Inside parry, you're obviously vulnerable over here, right? With St. George, the place you're most vulnerable is going to be basically anywhere below the sword, but the place that you're going to probably get cut the most, if someone gets you into St. George and you are at appropriate distance, is they can take your wrist, as he has the choice of go around the entire blade to try and get me, or pop over the basket and try and catch me, in which case I've got to be ready to possibly bring that out and swap into an outside guard. So that is a vulnerability there. You can also, if you're quick, cut a 7 and then morph it into a 3 or a 4, in which case the cut comes from below, so you will need to be ready to pop it down into an inside guard. But that all we'll talk about again in a minute. So that's St. George. He's a good friend. Now the other sort of more parry ones, if you will, are going to be our inside and outside half hangers. So let's address them first. So the inside half hanger. I am going to turn my arm flat over. Now it should not be up here like I'm peering over a lip. It should be just about the comfortable height of, I think this comes out to about my chin. I should be able to see clearly. I should not be blocking my view. And my sword should be guarding most all of my inside flank. So here's that again. My wrist is pretty much straight. Nothing crazy here. Now, what does this do for you? It guards the inside of your body. This is especially useful when someone cuts on the side and you have already executed a cutter sling along those lines. I just drop the tip to protect myself, catch on the inside, and I'm ready to roll out of that with another cut. This is also particularly useful to execute grabs. I can either grab above the sword or below the sword, depending upon what I'm doing. And it's just a fast combination to use. So definitely make sure that it's in your playbook. But all I do is I just drop the tip and fold myself over so I am here. Now, there's also the question of how far out of your body should you hold it away. I just hold it sort of naturally bent. He's coming from my body, I only need to cover about that much. I shouldn't be trying to push it out to the side, and I certainly shouldn't be, just leaving it in the middle. Now the outside half hanger, that's the stranger one, and the one that most people don't really do a whole lot. So with the outside half hanger, the inverse is true. So whereas here, I'm just protecting myself, here, I'm gonna be a little bit more out, so that way my shoulder is engaged, and I'm protecting myself. Now, the outside half hanger appears in 4th lesson of Angelo, and it's something that the antagonist does. He attacks the head, and then after voiding the leg twice, he steps out to defend his ribs. I will say, if you can, practice that motion as much as possible, because while it feels weird, it's probably your best bet at dealing with that combination I talked about last week, which is the 7 cut into a 6. So let's look at that really quick. If I am baited by the 7 into moving to St. George and someone cuts a 6 at my ribs, if I try to drop into the outside guard, either I drop like this, trying to catch the cut, so it's not a very well-formed outside guard, or I don't drop in time and I get caught. Either way, the only chance I have is if I manage to catch it on the basket, which is not all that great, versus if I'm up here and someone cuts my ribs and I drop the tip instead. That's a much faster, much more powerful motion, and will give me a better chance of deflecting that incoming attack. Plus, it leaves me in a decent position to launch out whatever cut I want. I could, for example, fold out into a 1 like I just did. I could even step forward with a thrust into the outside guard. I can pull back and execute a 2, a 6, a 4, anything really. It's not going to feel the most natural at first, but if you can get really good at that outside half hanger, you will be much less vulnerable to one of the most common feints to use. So, again, make sure that I'm not holding it at my shoulder height. It's just below. It's just protecting my flank. My arm is not locked. It's just engaged, and it's just kind of hanging there. So, now let's talk about the other one, which is, of course, going to be half circle, otherwise known as the spadroon guard. Now, this is a bit of a strange one, and you will see a couple different variations depending upon what you're doing. So, in regards to Angelo, it is only kind of briefly touched upon. The only time it's actually used in one of his lessons is he describes it as actually a defense of the wrist, which is an odd one, because for the most part, it just looks, especially if you've done any other style of fighting up to this point, it looks like kind of the inverse of the hanging guard, right? It's the other way, but it's not used offensively. Instead, the tip is dripping across. Sometimes you'll see it straight across, sometimes you'll see it more off to my side. That's the way I like to hold it. And my hand is relatively withdrawn, the basket about the same level as my head. Now, like I said, this is used in Angelo's play to defend the wrist at one point. It can also be used to defend the head. In other sort of contemporary sword systems, you will see this sort of outside position taken to defend because it very quickly launches into me cutting again. It is used very commonly in cavalry manuals, as pretty much everybody's going to be cutting backhanded with that. So if a guy is riding up on me and he cuts backhanded, that cut is coming here. As a right-handed person, it makes sense for me to cover in such a way. And you see that shown quite often. So I cover, and then I can return a cut backhanded as well. Now on foot, this still can occasionally save your bacon in the same way. I cut out, I've missed, whatever, they're coming around, I don't have time to move over here for whatever reason. You can certainly cover in this manner. With a shift, you can catch things. It's not the best sort of cover. St. George is better in pretty much every way, but it can occasionally save you. I would say if you want to use it in that way, you should probably be stepping out to the side with it rather than shifting. So I'm here, I have, ended up exposed, this cut is coming over, and rather than catching it like this, I have to do something else. I would recommend stepping with it. I keep my arm well out in front of me, and at this point, I'm just covering myself, so as it slips off, I can step forward with my attack again. It's very similar to motions that I will do in other styles of fighting, especially Messer if I'm fighting a left-handed person. But Spadroon / half circle, in general, is kind of an odd duck. It's something that doesn't come up a whole lot, mostly because St. George exists. However, it's there for a reason. And that reason in regards to Angelo is defending the wrist. Other sources do describe occasionally defending the head. So, there you go. Now, let's talk real quick about some transition between these, because I'm pretty much protecting all parts of me except for directly in front, but that's what the shift is for. A really good way to practice all of these defensive guards / parries is to get used to moving between them. And of course there's the manual exercise for that, but also let's talk a little bit about order of how you move things. So for example, here I am in St. George. I need to defend low. Now if I move my basket, that takes a certain amount of time. And we already talked about that particular target, right? So I'm going to move my blade instead to defend. Here comes the cut. I'm going to move my blade and my basket is attached. Here comes the cut. Even though I am moving my basket up, I really think of it more as I'm moving my blade and my whole arm moves in place, right? Here comes a cut to the inside, my blade goes out. So I would say think of these parries a lot less like moving your basket around to defend yourself, and think of it much more like moving kind of the middle of the sword. And I find that once I started doing that when I was first learning, all of my parries started becoming a lot crisper, and my sword started fully getting over to where I needed it to go, as opposed to lagging behind or things of that nature. Now that's not to say that sometimes your basket won't save your bacon. I'm going to tell you, it's got the scars to prove it, but for the most part, I do want to catch on the blade so I have control of his sword and can launch into better attacks. Plus, that generally means I'm at my optimum distance anyway. But all things considered, there are defensive guards. So to review them real quick, outside, inside, St. George, outside half hanger, inside half hanger, Spadroon, which is probably the only one I think where I do move the basket first. Anyway though, there's your quick review of some guards. Now there are some others here and there, some other sort of positions, for example, you will hear sometimes parrying in, carte, which would be corta basically, so parrying in that regard, which basically is just an inside guard. So you will see some variations here and there, depending upon what you're reading, and depending upon how much small sword / shearing sword / spadroon, which is a bit of a tongue twister, the particular master is working on. But overall, for the backsword and for saber mostly of the British style, that pretty much sums it up. Practice them well and they should save you. Either way, thank you very much for watching, and we'll go over some other techniques another time.